All right, let's piss off some Ford guys. Last week we did a video comparing what I would consider, and I think pretty much anybody would consider, the two undisputed kings of American power. The 426 Hemi and the big block Chevy. And we compared them from a core standpoint, the basic construction, the factors that led to them evolving to be the power kings that they are today. If you have zero brand allegiance, you don't care what nameplate is associated with any particular type of engine, you automatically, if you're looking for over-the-top power, 10, 12,000 horsepower top fuel dragsters, or anything along those lines, the 426 Hemi is the only real choice. If you're looking for maximum power in every other arena, it's the big block Chevy. Again, no brand allegiance. They just are what they are. Now, if you're a Ford guy, well, your choices, you have actually a lot of choices, but none of them really measure up to either of these. Because in typical Ford fashion, somewhere along the line, they screw the pooch. They overcomplicate things. They make problems where they don't need to exist. And because of that, yes, you can build extremely effective Ford engines. These, the top of the line engines, but they don't quite measure up to these guys right here. So in that video, in the comments, of course, he hates Fords. He's just a Ford hater. He doesn't want to recognize the Cammer. He doesn't want to talk about the Boss 9, right? or the 385. I want to talk about them. I'll talk about them now. Now, for the record, I am not a Ford hater. There are certain Fords I really love. I have genuine affection for the whole Windsor series. Yes, I know the 351 Cleveland. I know, I get it. Great engines. But the Glory engines, the Ford Glory engines, they have a lot of flaws. So let's do that. Let's go step by step. I don't happen to have any of them here, and I don't really know anybody who's got Ford stuff of this caliber laying around. So we're just going to have to go with words. I'll show comparisons on the engines that I do have, and we'll throw some pictures in there. But let's look at the Glory Ford engines. So let's talk about the Cammer. Okay, let's talk about, we'll touch on the tunnel port, because that was a Glory engine for a while. The Boss 9 and the Lima series, the 385 series engines. Let's start with the Cammer. So, let me sit down. So, you have to understand my relationship with the Cammer. I have never owned a Cammer, but about 20 years ago, I had a good friend of mine, Jim Barolero, and he's since passed. So Jim was a Cammer guy, okay? He loved Cammers. He lived for Cammers. So back in the 60s, he raced Cammer-powered funny cars. He had a wheel stander with a pair of twin Cammers in the back. This guy was just Cammer all the way. And we got to talking, and he wanted to get involved in nostalgia top fuel racing. And at the time, I was kind of involved in nostalgia top fuel racing. So we got together and said, yes, Jim, you build the car, and you got all these engine parts and stuff like that. And he actually had blocks cast for the purpose, special solid aluminum blocks. This was going to be like all out. I says, you build the car, supply the parts, and I'll drive the car, and I'll do everything else. So my knowledge of Cammers isn't from stuff that I read in books or watched in a video. My knowledge of Cammers is from actually hands-on studying these parts and getting to know the engines from a real, nitty-gritty perspective. So, the Cammer. Even before I got involved, like I said, really looking at this thing as something I was going to get, I was going to work with, I always thought it was kind of a silly idea, because ultimately pushrod engines, to this day, pushrod engines are the top of the heap. Why would Ford go through all of the trouble of putting the overhead cam setup together only to get banned by NASCAR? And that's another misconception. We're going to get into that too. Why would Ford go through all of the trouble of putting overhead cams on their Hemi, their version of the Hemi, when it was clear that there was no problem making power with push rods? All right, it was only after I really started digging into it that I found the reason that they did it. And it's, okay, it's almost too obvious. For this, we got to talk about the Chrysler Hemi first. So the 426 Hemi was a mating of the old Chrysler Hemi, the concept of the hemispherical combustion chamber with the wedge block. It was only able to be accomplished, the 426 Hemi, it was only able to be accomplished because of the unique characteristics of the wedge block. It was a lucky draw, lucky shot, okay? The reason they were able to do it is because in the wedge block, which from here down, it's exactly the same, the Hemi and a wedge. The wedge block has 5 bolts around each cylinder. So here's a bolt hole here, here's a bolt hole, this is a stud, but this is a bolt hole, this is a bolt hole, this is a bolt hole, this is a bolt hole. So you got 5 around each cylinder, okay? Because there are 5, these bolt holes right here are lower. They're closer to the section between the cylinders. On the camera, it's 4 bolts per cylinder, and the camera is narrower. So the bore spacing here is 4.8 inches. On a FE motor and the camera, it's 4.63 inches. So there's 170 thousandths less distance between the bore centers. This whole thing is tightened up. And because it's only 4 bolts per cylinder, instead of the top row, or I should say the middle row on this engine, but the top row, the bolt hole is right here, and it's tight. Now, because of this layout, Chrysler was able to use this hole, create this hole right here, eliminate the water jacket between the top of the cylinder and right here, okay, and add this hole. And this hole allows the exhaust pushrod to come out and operate the exhaust rocker effectively. Now, on a camera, you can't do this. So the simple truth is that the 426 Hemi was really a happy accident. The fact that the valley area of the wedge engine was workable to the point that they could create these scallops for the intake rockers or the intake push rods, these holes for the exhaust push rods, and these bosses for the top row of cylinder head bolts. It was really a happy accident that they were able to accomplish this with this particular casting, with the big block casting. On the FE motor, you have a completely different thing. The relationship between the lifter, the bank of lifters, the contour of the valley, the 4 bolts around each cylinder, and the fact that the cylinders are 170 thousandths of an inch closer to each other than they are in the Chrysler meant that there was no easy way. There was actually really no possible way to run push rods and operate the rockers on a Hemi head. But Ford was bent on using Hemi heads on their FE motor. Now, there's a lot of different things that they could have done. The most obvious would have been just follow Chevy instead of Chrysler, because eventually, just 5 years later, they did follow Chevy and they released the twisted wedge, the canted valve Lima motor, the 385, and the Boss 429 that went with that. But no, this is 1964 and Ford is bent on copying Chrysler. So, what were their choices? By the way, the combustion chamber on an FE motor on a Camry is actually an exact split between a first generation Chrysler Firepower 331, 354, 392 and a 426 Hemi. The first generation Chrysler has a very shallow combustion chamber. The second generation has a very deep combustion chamber, and the Ford combustion chamber measured out exactly between the two. I don't remember what the number was, but I just remember that it was ironic that CC wise it was exactly between the first and the second trivia, right? So what were Ford's choices if they're going to put Hemi heads on this thing? So the first is one that's been used on several engines over the years. Alfa Romeo did this. Arius, when they built the Chevy Hemi head conversion setup to put Hemi heads on a Chevy block, they use this setup too. And it's a link pushrod deal. So basically you've got a normal exhaust pushrod, and that pushrod operates a rocker. But instead of the rocker opening and closing a valve, the rocker pushes another push rod across the top of the motor to a second rocker, and that rocker opens and closes the exhaust valve. It sounds like a mousetrap, I know, but it works. It's proven to work. It works at high RPM. Mousetrap, but it was a solution. A second solution would have been something similar to what the current generation of Arias Hemi Chevy conversion heads use, which is an extremely long exhaust rocker. Like, this thing is like 10 inches long. It reaches all the way across the cylinder head. But I think that given the materials that they were working with, the construction techniques of the early 1960s, I don't really think something like that was possible. I think the exhaust rocker on the 426 Hemi was probably about as far as you could go given the manufacturing of the day. So that wasn't really an option. So Ford decided to go with timing chains. Okay, now you say to yourself, what's wrong with running an overhead cam engine with super long timing chains? It's done all the time. Modern engines, works just fine. Yeah, but those engines are, let's say, dainty compared to a 1960s hot rod NASCAR muscle car engine. We're talking about big valves. We're talking about big springs, big rockers, big, heavy, intricate valve train componentry that has to be spun at high RPM. You can't use just a dainty little chain on that with a bunch of plastic guides to keep it happy. Now, these things had big, heavy chains. It was a pretty brutal setup. So here's how it worked on the Ford. The camera used a dummy camshaft because you needed a partial camshaft to run the oil pump and distributor. So it had dummy camshaft. Then it had a normal timing chain, crank gear, cam gear, and the cam gear was used as a jack shaft to run a second timing chain. That was a 6-foot long jamie that ran all the way over the top of the engine like this and operated both overhead cams. And it worked on gasoline, carbureted. Yeah, it'll get the job done. But now for an extreme application, and this is really what we're talking about with these engines, the Chrysler and the big black Chevy, we're talking about extreme applications. Now you got some real problems. So because of the mass involved in the valve train and the timing chain and all of that, there were timing variations that really you couldn't live with. It was bad. So between the jack shaft cam gear and the first driven cam, under acceleration, and now imagine, think of yourself how quickly like a fuel motor accelerates, okay? So between the camshaft gear that we use as a jack shaft and the first driven cam, you would get a degree or two of stretch as the engine accelerated. Now between the first cam, the first driven cam, and the second cam, you would get around 4 degrees of retard, right? The cam would stretch that about that much and would retard the cam about 4 degrees. So you say to yourself, all right, just degree the cams to compensate for that and send it. But it's not that simple, because as the engine is accelerating and the chain is pulled taut as it's going to be, you'll get that retard built into just because of the stretch. But now, as the engine RPM begins to level out and everything finds a sense of equilibrium, then a second phenomenon called bicycle chaining happens. And that's where the links start to like group together a little bit. Like they don't hold that taut line anymore like they did when they were being pulled heavily during acceleration. Now they're kind of coasting, and those links don't necessarily stay as taut as they're supposed to. What that'll do is that'll shorten the length of the chain and advance the cam. So on the second cam, on the second driven cam on a camera, you can see up to 6 degrees of timing variation just through the course of a run. 4 degrees retard when it's on it, and then towards the top end, 2 degrees advance. That's not a workable situation. And racers tried grinding them in all different ways and all different degreeing and so on and so forth, but the camera always had that problem. So here's the thing with this. The camera was developed for NASCAR use, which means relatively steady state operation, give or take a few hundred RPM. Wind it up and that's it, it's done. So these variations in camshaft timing from the things being whipped back and forth by timing chain stretch and shrinkage and whatnot wasn't a factor. When the ban happened, and we'll talk about the ban in a second, when the ban happened, Ford took these engines that they built, like these 500 engines, and just dumped them in the hands of drag racers and said, here, you guys go blow them up and we'll go do other things. And that's exactly what they did. There was no more development. There was no more factory help. There was nothing. Just, here, go to Holman and Moody and go pick up your engines. So, the Camry held its own in drag racing during the tire slipping days. So 1965, 1966, and into 1967, the Camry held its own against the 426 Hemi and the earlier Chryslers. It was right there. But when the slipper clutch came in, tires changed a little bit, and they started to load the engines down. By 1968, the Camry couldn't keep up anymore. The weaknesses of the FE block, the thin saddles that would just like tear out, the 4 bolts around each cylinder, which caused the deck to move around, and all kinds of sealing issues as far as that goes. The Camry started, and then of course the timing variations, the Camry really started to fall behind. Until 1970. So there was a guy named Sneaky Pete Robinson. And Pete was an absolute genius. I've studied this guy's work and his philosophies and everything. Amazing guy. Pete was a committed Ford guy and had been running Camrys from 1965 until way past where they were viable in Top Fuel anymore. And to solve the camshaft issue, the timing issue, he created a gear drive. And this thing was just beautiful, like a Swiss watch stuck to the front of this Ford motor. So Pete built one working prototype, and it was on his car, and it was on the car that he was killed in. So Here's what happened with this now. When I decided to team up with Jim on this nostalgia Top Fuel car with the Camry, I says, well, if we're going to do this, we have to find Pete Robinson's gear drive setup. I pulled out all the stops. I went to ridiculous measures to try to get my hands on this setup. Nobody knew what happened to it. It could have ended up in a barn someplace, or what happens a lot of times with racers when they're killed in a car, the car gets buried behind the shop. But I moved heaven and hell to try to find this engine or leads to this engine, and I came up with nothing. Because it would have been so much easier to just copy what he had than to try to create our own. But that's all besides the point. That was the fix for the timing variations, but you couldn't fix the other shortcomings that were built into the FE block. So now let's talk about that ban for a second, because a legend has it that NASCAR banned all exotic engines once they got a load of the Camry. I was like, oh my God, this thing is just too much. We can't have this. That's not how it happened. So 1964, NASCAR allowed Chrysler to use the 426 Hemi because it was based on a production block. It was a modification of a production block. They let it slip. They didn't really want it to be in there, but they let it slip. Then Ford, to counter that, started working on the Camry. And a lot of people say, well, the legend is that once NASCAR got a look at the Camry, they were like, no more of this. It wasn't the Camry. It was actually a second Chrysler engine that was an answer to the Camry before the Camry was ever even actually released. And this was known as the Doomsday Hemi. So this was an actual engine. I did a video on it several years ago, held the parts in my hand. I know it exists. This was a dual overhead cam, 4-valve per cylinder Hemi, based off of the 426 Hemi block. And it used a timing belt, a really big timing belt, instead of the chain to make up for the variations that they may encounter during the course of racing. Once NASCAR found out about the Doomsday Hemi, that's when the ban came in. Not after they tested the Camry and it was the most power that anybody ever made. No, they drew the line at Chrysler's one-upmanship to Ford's attempted one-upmanship. That's what happened with that. So I got halfway home, I stopped for tacos and realized that I never talked about the tunnel port. And you can't have a discussion about Ford hitter engines without getting into the tunnel port. We'll insert this someplace between the Camry and the Boss 429, which is where the tunnel port fits. So when NASCAR bans the Camry for 1965, Ford turns its development back to the inline wedge FE as a stopgap while they're working on the Boss 429, which is going to come in 1969. So what they do is they take the regular Ford FE head, and if you're not familiar, the Ford FE head is a weird thing, more typical Ford weirdness, okay? It's really half a head casting, and the other half of the head casting, like the top half of the valve cover gasket, is in the intake manifold. Ford's better idea, right? Ford had fever dreams. There weren't better ideas. There were fever dreams. So, what they do is they enlarge the size of the intake port. They make it huge, round, and they stick the push rod tube. There's no room for a push rod anymore. Right smack dab in the middle of the intake port in the manifold. Traffic. Well, this worked, but it worked for a reason. I know all you Ford guys are like, "Wow, such a great engine." I tell you why it was a great engine. So, NASCAR allows Chrysler to bring the 426 back in 1966 because they've homologated it by putting it as regular production as the street Hemi. So they're allowed in. Chrysler was expecting to be able to run dual quads in NASCAR because they run dual quads on the street. But NASCAR says no. As long as you're going to have these Hemi heads, you have to use a single 4-barrel. They go to Ford and they say, well, since you're running an inline wedge, you can run dual quads. So for the next 3 years, 1965, 1966, 1966, 67, 68. The tunnel port holds its own. It gives the Chrysler Hemi and the Chevy fits everywhere. But it was allowed to run with dual quads. All of the other engines, anything that wasn't a true inline wedge, had to go with a single 4-barrel. Handicap much? Okay. Briefly, in 1968, Chrysler had been lobbying all along, saying, well, this is what we sell on the street, let us put a pair of AFBs or anything on the Hemi. So NASCAR relented just a little bit and he says, all right, go ahead. So for 1968, early 1968, like during testing, maybe up to Daytona, the Chryslers were allowed to use a dual quad intake manifold. This is a special dual quad intake manifold that has carburetor spacing about 2 inches wider apart than it does on the conventional street Hemi manifold. That was to accommodate the Holley carburetors. I'm trying to do this fast before my tacos come out. So they tested with this. The Hemi was light years ahead of the tunnel port using the same basic carburation. So then NASCAR says, no, back to the single 4-barrel for you. And that's where the Dominator came from. Dominator, Holley. That's another story. Okay, my tacos are coming. So that was the end of the line for development on the Camry. And by 1971, 1972, they had pretty much disappeared from drag racing. All of the various flaws, the weak main saddles and cylinder head sealing issues, and of course the cam and all of that other stuff, it just wasn't a practical engine to use. So it was gone. But its replacement, Ford's replacement for it, was already in the pipeline. The Boss 429. But before we talk about the Boss 429, we got to talk about the engine that it was based off of, which is the Lima engine, the 385 series. So, what Chevy did is essentially copy the big block Chevy. The deep skirt from the FE was gone, and they went with the normal pan rail like this. And, I mean, really, for all intents and purposes, they copied the big block Chevy. They made some improvements, especially in bore size. So the Lima motor has a 4.9-inch bore spacing. So you get really super big bores out of these things. If I remember correctly, there were some issues as far as camshaft bearings. They were undersized. I don't remember exactly what the deal was. They had some oiling quirks, but nothing that couldn't be worked around. Bigger bore, big block Chevy is what it is. Cylinder heads, copy of the big block Chevy. Not exact, not as extreme as far as angles go, but copy of the big block Chevy. Now, their ultimate engine based off of this was the Boss 429. So, this is an engine, okay, see, Ford shoots himself in the foot every time. All right, so the Boss 429 is based off of that Lima block, and it has the most state-of-the-art combustion chamber to be found in any of the muscle car era engines. I would go as far as to say that the Boss 429 combustion chamber is the prototype for all of the later combustion chambers, including the ones that we have today, are all basically extensions of that Boss 429 chamber. The dual quench pads. Remember in 1964, 1965, when they were developing these other engines, there was no concept of quench. This was understood later on in the 60s and incorporated into the Boss 429. But it had its limitations. Again, 4 bolts around each cylinder instead of 5. That makes a big difference. When you talk about extreme application, it makes a huge difference as far as keeping the bores round, keeping the deck flat, keeping the head from flopping around. When you're talking about extreme application, top fuel, blown alcohol, right? Extreme application, it's a problem. So Ford had several racers running these engines, and in 1970 and 1971, they held their own. They were doing okay. Connie Kalitta was running them. Mickey Thompson was running them. There were lots of racers were running these Boss 429s. But they had a fatal flaw. Well, they had a couple of fatal flaws. But one of the big ones was those engines, the Boss 429, was designed without a head gasket. Because Ford has to do things different. They've got the better idea, right? So rather than using a conventional head gasket, the Boss 429 used O-rings, one around each cylinder and then O-rings around each of the different water and oil passages in the deck of the block. All right, fine. Why they did this, I don't know. Fine for gasoline, carbureted, normally aspirated use, that type of thing. Relatively mild performance. But when you really put the suds to it, it's a problem. Not enough bolts around each cylinder and not enough material holding everything sealed. So they had a major issue with that. Drag racing evolution went along, and gaskets, regular copper gaskets with stainless O-rings took their places. But by 1972, the hitter cars, the real hitter cars, had started overdriving fuel pumps. So they had been running up to that point, they had been running like the end of the 1100s, they came up to the end of the 1200, and then 1972, they started to overdrive the pumps. It wasn't really a thing, like everybody did it until like 73, but they started overdriving the pumps. And when they overdrove the pumps, coupled with the clutches and the traction, the tires that they had at that point, well, now any weak link in a production block was going to show. And remember, this is before all of the aftermarket blocks came in. Everybody was still using basically factory assemblies. So at that point, the Boss 429 could not keep up. One of my favorite thing, there's a picture of Connie Kalitta. I got it here. There's a picture of Connie Kalitta standing next to his funny car. And it's a Mustang-bodied funny car. And Kalitta had run Cameras, which he was quoted as saying, they're shit. That's it. That was Connie Kalitta's statement on the Camera. When they transitioned to the Boss 429, he had a factory deal, got all of those engines, and on his Mustang-bodied funny car, where it's lettered Boss, right on the side, if you look at the engine that's actually in the car, it's a 426 Hemi. He ran the Boss 429 when he had to, for whatever appearance reasons, appearances that he would be required to use it, but when he could, he stuck a 426 Hemi in there, and his pictures to prove it. So by 1973, all of the advancements in fuel technology at that point highlighted all of the weak spots of that particular combination, and it was obsolete also. Now, that wasn't the end of the line for the Boss 429, because 1982, the NHRA went to a 500 cubic inch limit in Pro Stock. So previous to that, Pro Stock was run on a cubic inch to weight basis. So you'd have to carry X amount of pounds for X amount of cubic inches. In 1982, they went to 500 cubic inches across the board and a minimum weight. At that point, the Boss 429 actually came into its own. So, and especially at the mountain motor size, because while NHRA limited people to 500 cubic inches, the IHRA and the AHRA allowed unlimited cubic inches. And the Boss 429, based on that 4.9 inch bore spacing, and the dimensions of the engine in general, went to 700 plus cubic inches easily, where all of the other engines struggled at it. And because it had a beautiful combustion chamber, with those dual quench pads and everything else, it was a true hitter in Pro Stock, both in 500 inch legal and mountain motor and outlaw Pro Stock, all through the 80s and the 90s. That engine really came into its own. And at that level, the 4 bolts around each cylinder doesn't really matter that very much. It's only when you go to extreme levels. So the Boss 429 was definitely a successful engine in that respect, but you can't put it in the same league as the 426 Hemi or the big block Chevy, because at ultimate applications, unless you're a Ford guy, specifically going to run a Ford engine, you don't even look at it. You go right to the Hemi, you go right to the Rat. So, but all due respect to the Boss 429, it just doesn't, you know, line up with these other engines. Now, as far as the Lima motor in general goes, that was another deal where I think Ford more or less shot itself in the foot. It got released late into the muscle car era. Yes, it was available in many muscle cars, many configurations, some really stout packages too. But it was the last couple of years of it, and Ford's never gained the street cred that the Chryslers and the General Motors products did. Ford cars were always difficult to work on. They were always unorthodox. The parts were always a little more expensive. There weren't as many people playing around with them. So off the showroom floor, don't get me wrong now, off the showroom floor, they held their own against everything that was out there. But once you started modifying them, once you went past that first stage of modifying now, and now you're doing heads and cam and all of that other stuff, well, now the Ford becomes a real pain in the ass for packaging and complexity. They just were not fun to work on. So Fords from the middle 70s on never really gained the same street cred, the same street following, the same aftermarket support, and therefore evolution that the other engines did from the other manufacturers. So yeah, they're great engines. The big block Ford is a fantastic engine, but it doesn't measure up in a lot of ways to the other ones. All right, I think, man, this video went way longer than I wanted it to. And there's so many things I want to talk about. There's so many things I could talk about with it. Maybe we'll pick it up discussion for another era. I know a lot of you guys asked about, oh, what about Pontiacs? What about this? What about that? Yeah, we can do that, but let's end this one now. I don't hate Fords, but you cannot put them in the same league with these other two engines, which is the ones we featured in that last video. Shoot me. I love the Windsor though. I absolutely love Windsors. I'll see you tomorrow.